Today we're here to answer the question, how to talk about getting old and not be afraid. I'm Pamela D Wilson. My website is PamelaDWilson.com. On there, a lot of helpful information for caregivers and aging adults. I've worked in the field of caregiving and aging for more than 20 years. And when I go around the country and virtually, and I meet with people and I talk to groups and I do courses, people are always concerned about talking about aging and their fears about aging, especially because, let's face it, it's not a popular topic, and who wants to get old? But it's going to happen to all of us. So in this video, I want to share a couple ideas. One is the fact that the obvious when we talk about aging and caregiving is not always the obvious. Then the skills that caregivers and aging adults need to manage through all of this aging and getting old thing, and how we can think about all of this differently and be proactive so that when concerns come up in our families, we can manage through them and we know how and when to get help. So I want to share a story of a client of mine. I was a court-appointed guardian for a gentleman who was living in a small assisted living community called a board and care. I visited him one day. He was doing great. The next morning, I get a call from the care staff that says, "Pamela, I think Mr. John needs a wheelchair." And I said, "Now, why would he need a wheelchair? I was there just yesterday. He was walking around. He was doing great. There were no issues. I don't know how one day we are great and then the next morning, all of a sudden, we need a wheelchair." So I started asking a lot of questions. And I said, "Well, did he sleep well last night? Can you do me a favor? Can you take his blood pressure? Because there's a monitor there. Can you take his pulse oxygen? And can you take his temperature? Then do that and call me back. And in the meantime, find out if he had anything to drink or eat, if he was up during the night, if he went to the bathroom." So I wait and the phone rings 10 minutes later. And they say, "Oh, Pamela, he has a fever. His pulse oxygen is very low at about 85 and his blood pressure's low." So I said, "Well, I don't really think he needs a wheelchair. I think he needs to go to the emergency room because he probably has pneumonia or urinary tract infection. So call 911 and send him out." Now, if you were a family caregiver and you didn't know what I know and you didn't have the experience that I had, you might have said, "Well, maybe he does need a wheelchair. Let me pick one up. I'll bring it by in 2 days." And then you let that go. And nothing happened. And your mom or dad stayed in bed for a day or two. And all of a sudden they got really sick. And they went to the emergency room and it was too late and they died. The things that most family caregivers don't know is that care staff in these communities, they're not medically trained. They don't know what to do unless you are telling them, unless you are directing them. And if you don't know all those things, loved ones die. Loved ones have more serious health issues than they need to because you don't know how to watch out for these things. The thing to know about how to talk about getting old and not being afraid is there's no way you can know all these things. It's not your fault. You haven't been a caregiver before. Or if you have, maybe you didn't run into this particular issue. This is why consulting a care manager like myself or an elder care expert like myself when you're planning for care of your parents is a good thing. Let's talk about skills that caregivers need when you're working with the healthcare system. Persistence, resilience to bounce back. You want to learn how to be an advocate, because when my client, who I shared the story about, went to the hospital, the doctor called me and said, "Oh, Pamela, he has pneumonia, but he's 95. Maybe we should not treat him. Maybe we should just let him go the way of nature and let him pass away." Now, I had legal responsibility for this client, and I knew him better than anybody else, I knew that if he would get antibiotics, he would bounce back and he would be fine. And I also knew that he would want to be treated. Things that you're going to run into are going to be doctors and healthcare providers telling you that you're old, or your parent is old, or your grandparent is old. And maybe they shouldn't be treated because old people are viewed sometimes as expendable. Healthcare providers would rather treat somebody who is 20 years old than somebody who's 80 years old. That's the healthcare bias that we all are going to face as early as our fifth or sixth decade. In our 50s or 60s, we will start to experience this, and women more than men, because women regularly go to the doctor. We're seen as the hypochondriacs, we're seen as the complainers, where men who never seek medical care, when they do seek medical care, it has to be really bad. We all know this. So how do we change our brains to think differently about all of this? I want to share a story. It's written by an actress named Portia Nelson. And if any of you watched the soap opera All My Children years and years and years ago, you might remember her as Mrs. Gurney, who was the nanny. She wrote a poem, and it was called There's a Hole in My Sidewalk. And the idea of it is I'm a person and I'm walking down the street and I fall in this hole. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I fell in this hole. I have a problem. How do I get out of it? So the next day I'm walking down the same street and I fell in the hole. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I did it again. My first thought on day one was, well, it's not my fault. I didn't know the hole was there. On day two, when I fall back in that hole, it's kind of like, okay, I knew it was there. I did the same thing. Maybe it is my fault. Day number three, I'm walking down the sidewalk. I'm thinking, I know that hole is there. I'm going to just walk around it today. But the results really of what I'm doing don't change. So on day four, I'm thinking, you know what? I am going to take a different path to work. I'm not going to walk down that sidewalk. I'm going to walk down a different sidewalk. I'm going to take a different route. This is the idea of all of us looking at aging and health and caregiving a little differently. Mostly because, as I say, the obvious is not the obvious. And I want to close this by talking about heart disease and high blood pressure like it was a gateway drug. So if you hear in the news, many people say, oh, marijuana, somebody smokes marijuana, they're going to start doing cocaine and they're going to take other drugs and they're going to get hooked on methamphetamines and all kinds of stuff. Well, a diagnosis of high blood pressure is like a gateway drug to all kinds of health problems if we don't pay attention to it and if we don't understand the consequences. High blood pressure can turn into serious heart disease. It can turn into you needing stents because the arteries in your heart are clogged. It can turn into bypass surgery because your heart isn't pumping enough. Congestive heart failure, circulation issues in your body. If you are an older person, do your legs hurt? That's neuropathy. That's a circulatory issue. If your feet and your toes hurt and you don't have feeling, that is a circulatory issue. If you have weeping wounds on your legs, that's because your heart's not pumping enough blood because you haven't gotten enough exercise. If you have trouble breathing, heart disease is related to strokes. It's related to kidney disease. It's related to eventually possibly needing dialysis. It's related to a lack of circulation in the brain that causes vascular dementia. Now, I'm sure many of you never realize this because your doctors don't have time to educate you about all of this information and the consequences. So nobody ever thinks to ask. What happens? 10, 20, 30 years down the road, that little concern about high blood pressure that you thought, well, not important, I'll just take a pill. Well, it turns into a whole host of other issues, and you need care from your loved ones. So if you are a young adult today, if you are a middle-aged person, I encourage you to seek information about caregiving and aging. Learn how to make a care plan for yourself for aging. And What happens if you need care? How do you manage all of your health issues? There is plenty of information about this on my website at PamelaDWilson.com, in my online caregiving courses, in my weekly podcast, and if you are part of a group or in the community, or if you work for a company, ask your human resources department for caregiver education. I would be happy to come and speak to your group wherever you are, either in person or virtually. I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Have a fabulous day today. I will see you again soon in another video.